Melissa Bell in Paris, and this is CNN.
Closing bell ringing on Wall Street. Dow Jones Industrials down 126 points. The market off sharply. The Nasdaq is also down, and the S&P 500. As Charles River closed things up, I think we call it a firm gavel. Trading is over. It's the middle of August. It's August the 13th. Tonight, President Erdogan says he's been stabbed in the back as the Turkish lira heads ever lower. Elon Musk explains how a meeting with the Saudis led to that infamous market-moving tweet, funding secured. And he's the runner-up. They all came to see, absolutely. Tiger Woods is electrifying the golf world all over again. I'm Richard Quest, live in the world's financial capital, New York City, where, of course, I mean business. Good evening. Tonight, Turkey's crisis reverberates through global markets. The Turkish lira is sliding sharply and continues to do so. And President Erdogan is defiant against possible emergency measures, instead choosing to blame a foreign conspiracy, as he sees it, against the Turkish economy. So you need to look at the numbers and see exactly how things moved. And this really does show it. The Turkish lira versus the dollar over the past 3 months. Now, it's down some 26% over the last 2 days, which is quite a dramatic fall off, even allowing for the relative stability. But this clearly shows the dispute with the US, Erdogan's comments on his unorthodox economics, and, of course, the lira falls out of bed. The crisis in Turkey, well, we need to look at its origins. It's, first of all, the refusal to raise interest rates. When they refused to raise interest rates, suddenly the central bank lost its credibility, since the market had been hoping and indeed expecting that something would be done. So now the contagion starts to move from Turkey to the other emerging markets. For instance, in South Africa, you've got the rand falling as much as 8% to a 2-year low. And go across to Argentina, and you have the peso hitting record lows, hiked rates by 5%. And remember, the country's already in an IMF program. And, of course, straight up to Europe, where it's the mature banks and the banking system where stocks continue to fall, and the ECB is watching closely to see just how deep the contagion is. John Terrace is our emerging markets editor, joins me now. Of those three that I sort of mentioned, John, you know, the emerging markets, Argentina, South Africa, or the banks in Europe, which is the most pressing crisis?
I would think the banks in Europe, Richard, because of the exposure of some $150 billion. I'm watching the commodity markets very carefully, and you flagged it on Friday when we had our discussion. We've seen a drop in the commodity basket so far of about 5%. This is nowhere near where we saw in the Asian crisis in 1998 and 1999 when we had a correction of 30%, or during the global financial crisis when commodities dumped out by some 37%. But I have to be candid here. If I'm an average Turk or an investor in Turkish assets, I'm a bit baffled tonight because, as you know, Monday, President Erdogan said, look, don't panic. The currency is going to recover. We have this emergency plan. On Friday and Saturday, he's saying, sell your gold, sell your dollars. We need support for the lira. Now, he's thrown assets at it. His finance minister, the central bank governor, the capital markets authority, they have a 100-day plan, but that's part of the criticism. Criticism number two, you covered on your lead-in there. He doesn't want to raise interest rates. He's dead set against it. He's against the International Monetary Fund as well. And in fact, that's how he created the party coming back in 2000, against the global institutions. So he points outwards, not inwards. Let's take a closer look. It's an economic disaster, analysts say, caused mainly by the man in charge. Turkish leader Recep Tayyip Erdogan once again defiant on Monday, quick to blame everyone else but himself for an economy in the firing line and a currency on the brink.
Do not worry about it. Be relaxed about it. We did not make concessions from the rules of free market economy. Nobody should listen to speculations that say otherwise.
The Turkish lira continues to crumble, dropping nearly 20% in the past week of trading. It's the result of years of mismanagement at the top, critics say. Lavish spending on mega projects like airports and bridges, symbols meant to burnish Erdogan's image and win him re-election. Now he's faced with a soaring current account deficit, inflation of nearly 16%, and corporate debt, which is priced in lira and rising.
The fall of the Turkish lira is only the beginning of a real economic crisis, of a possible recession in Turkey. We would need to see complete change in economic policies.
That change is unlikely as Erdogan now tightens his grip over the country's central bank after re-election in June, and he installed his son-in-law as both finance and treasury minister.
Don't panic about the dollar. This has nothing to do with the dollar. If they have their dollars, we have our God. Stay calm.
The lira's tailspin is starting to rattle global markets, with European banks hit particularly hard. And there's a political plot twist as well. Last week, President Trump said he would slap new tariffs on Turkey, a punishment for Erdogan continuing to jail an American pastor named Andrew Brunson. Over the weekend, Erdogan showed no signs of backing down.
You can never bring this nation in line with the language of threats. We understand the language of law and rights, but not threats.
He singled out the U.S. and currency speculators for waging, quote, economic war against Turkey, casting no blame on his own economic policy. So he was critical of President Trump, but he took a page out of his playbook today. Richard, they're going to go after 350 or nearly that many Facebook users and social media outlets trying to crack down on what they call fake news. It looks like emergency measures are starting to crop up in Turkey as a result of this correction.
John Defterios in London. Thank you, John. As President Erdogan resists typical monetary policy, orthodox policies, it's unclear where this crisis goes next. Recession and a debt crisis absolutely on the horizon, and worse may be yet to come. There could be an IMF bailout, well, the last one in 2000, but could they go to the IMF? Would they be willing to withstand and take the austerity measures necessary? Politically difficult, a bad history, and the austerity would be painful and go against everything that Erdogan said. Then they could go for capital controls. Well, they've worked in the past, and like Greece, it would help the lira, but it could hurt Turkish businesses, and capital controls only work in the short term to give confidence. And then Turkey could go it alone. The debt's manageable for now and hope for the best, and maybe get money from Qatar or Russia or China. Ken Rogoff's a former chief economist at the IMF and now at Harvard. This is whenever a leader starts to say that the interest rate laws don't apply to them, the market economy laws don't apply to them, this usually ends badly.
This is certainly headed to end badly. I think the only way it can end okay for Turkey, at least in the short run, is to go to the IMF, because he has to do those austerity measures you mentioned anyway. People are not going to keep pouring money into Turkey. They are borrowing money heavily. That money is drying up. And the IMF can give them a bit of money, maybe more, to help cushion that. But of course, he doesn't want to go to the IMF. He's campaigned against them. And President Trump has veto power at the IMF, and he certainly doesn't want to accommodate him. He's in a very tough corner.
How bad is the economic situation, though? Can they brazen it out?
I don't think so. Not without, something that's tantamount to a default. You mentioned capital controls, but the trouble is the way Turkey's been buoyed over the years, what's really helped it is there are Turks all over the world making money, putting their money back into Turkey. And if they think they're going to be capital controls that are going to lock it in, that are going to depreciate their money, they're not going to do that. So I think it's very, very hard if you scare away your base, these expat Turks that are pouring in money.
Your former employer, the IMF, have been warning about emerging markets and emerging markets risk. Now, we know Argentina's already in a program, and you think Argentina may eventually default, but
Yes.
Nobody seems to. What has been the problem that the IMF is warning about? What's the issue that the chickens have now come home to roost?
I mean, very simply, we live in a dollar world. These countries borrow in dollars, and they borrow a lot compared to, the risk that they take. And their income, their currencies, when they depreciate, it raises the burden of the dollar debt. When the lira shrinks by 40%, it expands the burden of the debt they have to pay in dollars that much. The markets look at that and they say, well, show us that you're prepared to do something. And if you're not, the currency goes down more, and eventually it comes to an end. That's the crux of it, and that's what has everyone nervous. And I would amplify that by saying they're worried that maybe the IMF won't be there in every case. When, Brazil has to go to the IMF. You mentioned South Africa earlier. Is President Trump going to have some condition that's politically unpalatable and they'd rather default? It's getting people scared.
Are we talking about defaults here? Are we? I mean, it doesn't happen very often. Sovereign default happens few and far between, and when it does, the ripple effects are calamitous.
Well, in the case of Turkey, if they can't go to the IMF, maybe they'll get a bridge loan for a little while from Qatar, from China, for somebody, but it's not going to last. And those places do not have the expertise to fix things. They really, to buy time, there's one game in town. They need to go to the IMF. I'm not saying the IMF's perfect, but they're going to have austerity, and at least they can blame it on the IMF. Argentina has done that, but the trouble is if they don't undertake reforms, if they don't get their house in order after a few years, they're still going to default. I think that may well happen. It happened last time.
That's the depressing part. That is the depressing part about this. It's happened before, it's happened again, and it begs the question, did they learn nothing?
Well, it's probably not going to happen everywhere, and people make a lot of money in the meantime, but it's particularly in Argentina, it's very sad because I think the government was doing a lot of right things. In Turkey, I mean, he's, going off the rails, and the president in many dimensions, and needs, to find a way to rein itself in. Has his son-in-law for the finance minister. He won't let the central bank raise interest rates, an autocrat, all the recipe for having a big default.
Ken Rogoff, we appreciate your time, sir, tonight. Thank you very much indeed. Later on Grassroots Business, I'll be joined by Britain's former ambassador to Turkey, Sir Peter Westmacott. Peter will be with us to put all of this into perspective. US stocks avoided the kind of heavy selling that we saw, at least during the course of the session. Look, very heavily down around 1 o'clock in the afternoon. The morning session was buoyant, but it sort of recovered, and it's off just 125, a half a percentage point. The S&P 500 fell for the fourth straight day. Now, this is the longest losing streak for the S&P since March. And as for Tesla, well, Tesla's shares, they were down some... they were down again today, just off a fraction or so, but they are up. They were up 20% overall in August, so we're waiting to see, of course, how that moves on. And we now know why Elon Musk shocked the market by saying he was ready to take Tesla private. A new blog post from Musk lays out the timeline of exactly what he's been doing. On July the 31st, he met with the Saudi Sovereign Wealth Fund, following, in his words, multiple approaches from them. On August the 2nd, Musk told his board that he wants to take Tesla private and that he'll reach out to the largest shareholders because obviously they have to tell them. However, telling the largest or discussing with the largest shareholders this, it would only be fair, he says, that on August the 7th, he made the infamous funding secured announcement on Twitter. Paula Monica is with me to talk about this. So he makes all these statements.
Yes.
And he says what he's got to say, and it's the Saudis who's behind him.
It is now clear that the Saudis are interested in potentially helping Elon Musk take Tesla private, but there still are a lot of things that I think need to be done, Richard, before that can actually be accomplished. And clearly the market doesn't believe it's going to get done because Tesla shares are now trading, just under $360. That's a far cry from the 420 that he said he wants to take Tesla private.
Does his explanation hold water? I mean, is it satisfactory? I read it in detail. It seems to be an entirely justifiable statement to say funding secured. The Saudis are clearly wanting to do it.
Yeah, I think that he probably has enough wiggle room that he would not get into any trouble with the SEC because he is being as upfront as he possibly can be about the negotiations and what he sees at this time is the likelihood of a deal getting done. But again, there's a difference between funding secured and an actual announcement saying we're taking Tesla private at this.
Right, but his point is valid that he couldn't talk to the largest shareholders and not tell everybody else. It would be inequitable.
Yeah, I think that is
to do one without the other. So he had to. And I'm just wondering whether, I guess what I'm really wondering is whether our angst and gnashing and wailing of teeth is just the way he did it rather than what he did.
I think that could be a part of it because, yeah, let's be honest here. This was a very untraditional Elon Musk-esque sort of way of making the announcement to the world. Most people would have said, you know, okay, we met with the board. Now we're going to have the lawyers go over this carefully crafted press release, and we're going to have an SEC filing. Musk doesn't go for any of that. It just boom, 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 a couple of characters and tweets it out to the world, $420 funding secured, which, you know, again, is not the way most corporate executives would do things.
No, but
this is 2018, so why
the way the
not?
President of the United States would do it.
That is true.
No, thank you.
Not the way previous presidents would have done it, even in the age of Twitter, I would argue.
Good point. All right. As we continue, Express means business. Heathrow Airport is a disgrace when it comes to immigration. That's not just me thinking or saying that. Virgin Atlantic has the numbers that prove Britain's Home Office fails 95% of the time in getting people through on their target time.